Hello, everyone, and welcome to Meet a Scientist, sponsored by New Mexico EPSCOR. I'm your host, Anthony Salvagno, over at Explora Science Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Today, we have Dr. Ken Cradock, who is a scientist in the biology department at Eastern New Mexico University. Thanks for joining us today, Ken.
Hi, good morning.
So tell us a little bit about what it is that you do.
So at Eastern, I'm primarily in teaching, but my research area is in vector-borne diseases. So a vector-borne disease is a disease that's spread by another organism to people, animals, or plants. So mostly people are thinking about human and animal health with vector-borne diseases. So we're thinking mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, things like that. But in the plant arena, things like aphids or whiteflies can also spread diseases to plants. So that's the area I'm interested in, is in that whole system of the hosts, the animals getting sick, or the plants getting sick, the pathogens, the viruses, the bacteria, sometimes protists like malaria that are actually making the organism sick, and then the vectors themselves, the mosquitoes, the ticks, the aphids, and so on. And how does that all come together in a disease system? And then once we know that, we can hopefully throw a wrench in the system and limit the amount of spread of those diseases to the hosts and thereby overall improve health.
That's very cool. So what do you find most interesting about the research that you do?
It's just always challenging. There's always something new. And as is true in many areas of science, you answer one question and end up with multiple more questions coming out of the answer. So it's a never-ending puzzle that needs to be addressed. And sometimes it's a big question, like, wow, that was really unexpected. We might have to rethink how we view a particular situation. Or more, it's opening up finer and finer details. Okay, now we know this, then we can get into the molecular or the levels or the proteomics and really go down into the fine details of understanding how this works. And that's really, in the last couple of years, opened up some really exciting opportunities, as well as challenges in terms of vector control, especially with mosquitoes. So we can potentially modify mosquitoes genetically so that they are no longer able to transmit certain diseases, which is really exciting. On the flip side, then you're dealing with genetically engineered organisms being released into the environment, and folks have a lot of concerns about that on a general sense. And then just trying to tell people that you're going to release a few million mosquitoes in their neighborhood comes with its own PR concerns as well, and a lot of thinking in advance of that. You can't just go and do that, because you need to let people know why and why it's going to benefit them in the long run, that type of thing. So it's just the continual learning, the continual challenges, and the diversity of the challenges that are presented keep the field pretty exciting.
Yeah, so you mentioned, this issue of having to release, mosquitoes into the wild to kind of combat the diseases that you're fighting. And nobody likes mosquitoes, so I imagine that's quite problematic.
Yes.
What does that process usually look like?
The releases?
Yeah.
So usually there's an upfront education program. This hasn't really been done in the United States much. They've got a couple of test sites down in the Florida Keys where they've been trying it. It's been done a little bit in South and Central America, in the Caribbean. So it starts off with an education campaign. So those communication skills are really important, being able to engage with the local community to let them know what you're going to be doing and why it's important. And that usually takes, it seems, about a couple of months of laying the groundwork for local acceptance, local education, which isn't always forthcoming. And a couple of releases have been delayed or even halted because the local community just wasn't sufficiently on board. So in the interests of preserving good communication and goodwill, the project was changed to accommodate that. But then all going well, if the community is willing and on board, then the releases take place, often from moving vehicles. So it'll be a van or a pickup with a canopy on the back, and there'll be little ports in the side, and mosquitoes are then released through those ports into the community environment, and then they will go and find other mosquitoes. It's usually transmitted through reproduction activities that the modifications that are going to suppress the mosquito population are transmitted. So sometimes it's a genetic level, sometimes it's basically an STD, some kind of microbe that inhibits reproduction that is done. So often it's male mosquitoes that are released, and males don't actually bite people. So that's usually a good selling point. If we can legitimately say that it's the males that are being released, that helps allay a lot of fears. But in some cases, it's the females that need to be released, and those do bite. And so that requires a bit more convincing that we're going to release a couple of million of biting things into you in the backyard, pretty much.
That's awesome. I love hearing about this sort of research, but I want to switch gears just a little bit. So our viewers might notice that you don't have a New Mexican accent. And so I'd like to ask you, how did you get into your line of work, and why did that take you to Eastern New Mexico?
It started off back when I was in high school, really, and starting to think about what I might want to do with my life after 12th grade. And I'd always had an interest in insects in general, arthropods in general. Spiders were actually a focus at the time, but while there are careers for spider biologists, they are very few and far between. And I wasn't quite confident enough in my skills to walk that path. So I went for a more general approach. There's also not a lot of courses specifically in spiders at universities, at least not at the undergraduate level. And so I started looking at what was being offered at the universities. I worked with career counselors, and they helped make some suggestions. And this is back in South Africa. So things are a little bit different from how they are here in the US, but I don't think that the details at this level are that important. But I ended up picking two majors, which is fairly common in South Africa. And one was plant pathology, which is the study of plant diseases. And then the other was entomology, the study of insects, although more commonly that also involves invertebrate zoology being incorporated into that. So not just other arthropods, but also nematodes and annelids and all those other kinds of things without backbones, in essence. Then moving on to graduate school, as I settled into, I'm really interested in the intersection of disease and arthropods. Looking at the careers that involved, you can absolutely get a career with a bachelor's degree in that area. But I was getting interested in actually doing the research behind understanding how these systems worked, and that typically requires graduate work. And so moved into the graduate program. Initially, I was a little cavalier, and I spoke to my advisor-to-be about working with level 4 pathogens. So those are the really dangerous things that are highly infectious, probably no cure, and they're going to kill you in some absolutely horrible fashion. And you're with people in biohazard suits for the last few days of your life. And he very sagely suggested that I probably wanted to work on plant pathogens, because when you make a mistake in the lab, it's not going to kill you, your lab mates, or anyone else. And looking back, that was very good advice. In addition, the department I was in didn't have the facilities to do that type of work anyway. My master's work was looking at aphid-borne viruses in zucchini crops. Without going into too many details, there's a lot of challenges. The particular group of viruses I was looking at and the aphids cannot be controlled with pesticides. It actually makes the situation worse. And so you have to be looking at non-chemical control methods to try and still allow the farmers to get a productive crop. So I investigated a variety of things, from versions of zucchini, cultivars of zucchini that are tolerant or resistant to the viruses, to various ways to keep the aphids, other than chemicals, out of the plots. So that was my master's work. By that time, I'd become enamored with getting a PhD. For many areas, a master's is all you would need to do work, especially if you're looking at a government agency. A master's is probably as far as you want to go. But this is where a bit of career research comes in handy, really looking at what an individual would want out of their career and looking at the types of jobs and what are required on the job adverts. Do you need a master's degree, or is a PhD required or recommended? Sometimes a PhD makes you overqualified and you become ineligible for certain types of jobs. So career research is really important at that point. So looking at what I wanted to do, I wanted to work in a university environment, and in the sciences that typically requires a PhD. And so I was getting set on that, and then life will throw you curveballs. Texas A&M stole my advisor. He is a citrus virologist, and they thought he would make a nice addition to their citrus virology program. And so he's still working over there now over in on the southeast end of Texas with their citrus research. But that left me without an advisor for my PhD, and I started looking around, and a guest lecturer from the Ohio State University, Dr. Glenn Needham, had visited the campus in South Africa and talked about ticks and how they spread diseases, and that sounded pretty interesting. So I got in contact with him, and he had a spot in his lab. I was able to go through all the paperwork issues of getting over from South Africa, and ended up doing my PhD in Columbus, Ohio at Ohio State, and looked at using entomopathogens, so pathogens that are lethal to insects and arthropods in general, specifically fungi, as a potential management agent for ticks, because ticks are getting resistant to a lot of chemicals, and a lot of the chemicals that still work are really potent. And so we don't really want to use them around people or companion animals and that type of thing. So looking at alternative measures that are safer to people and animals was what I focused my PhD on. While I was doing that, I worked as a graduate teaching assistant, and discovered I actually quite liked teaching. So as I was wrapping up my dissertation studies, started looking around for positions, and that's how I ended up at Eastern New Mexico University. They had a position that was focused on teaching, but that would also allow me to continue my research, and it was a good match. And that's how I ended up in Portales, New Mexico at ENMU.
That's quite a story of twists and turns. So if you could kind of go back and tell your 10-year-old self some advice, what would it be based on your life path?
Probably do more math. It's I kind of taptoed a little bit around the math and statistics aspects of things. And I wish I hadn't. I wish I'd bitten the bullet a little harder and pushed myself a little bit harder on that front. But otherwise, just be curious. Continue to be curious, not just about your passion, but about learning in general. Every so often, really interesting tidbits that are relevant to what you're doing in research come from unexpected areas. And so of late, I've gotten really interested in the history of science. How did we get to where we are now? Why do we have the procedures we have now? Why do we have the understanding of this and not that? Why were certain diseases emphasized or not emphasized in our research and so on? And that's really informative in understanding the gaps in our knowledge base that we have now. So really the biggest thing is just stay curious, never shut a door if you can avoid it, and just give it a full court press, basically. Don't let any of the subjects slack, even if you think this is not an area I ever want to go in. So for example, I'm not particularly artistic, but it turns out being able to draw is actually kind of useful. Photographs are good, but in many ways, a diagram is much better. It can capture more variation. A photograph is a capture of that particular specimen at that particular time, whereas when you're making a diagram, you can capture sometimes a bit more variation of that particular structure or organism. And so having some artistic skills is definitely useful. Science is only as useful as who you can communicate it to. And so working on language skills, both written and spoken, is really, really important. It took me a long time to be comfortable speaking to people. If you had told me in high school that I would have a career that required me to stand in front of tens of, sometimes even hundreds of people and talk, I would have said you were crazy, because that sounded about like the least appealing thing I could imagine at the time. And it took a lot of work to get there, but it was useful. And I look back to my English teacher in high school. She made me do the debate team and the public speaking team, and put all of us on the team through a Toastmasters course. And although I really liked her class, I really questioned whether she liked me when she made me do those types of things. But looking back, she knew what I needed, and I thank her for it often, because it provided skills that have become very useful to me in my career.
That's amazing. Before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you, is there anything else that you wanted to plug while we have this platform?
I think is anyone listening, especially those who are students and investigating what they might want to do, is find a career that you're passionate about. Obviously, I'm passionate about science, and specifically arthropods that bite things. That's my passion, but you need to do your passion. And if you're still figuring out what that is, don't close any doors on yourself. So work hard across the board, maximize grades, maximize opportunities, that internship that comes around, that volunteer opportunity. Keep doing it. Take advantage of that. Look to build your skill set and your resume so that down the road, as opportunities present themselves, you're the best prepared you can be to take advantage of those opportunities you don't yet know are there.
Thank you so much for the advice and for your time. And, thanks for just being a part of Meet a Scientist.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.